There was always something different about Clint Eastwood. Even when Hollywood was overflowing with loud personalities, public scandals, and stars desperate for attention, Clint Eastwood somehow remained untouchable, quiet, cold, almost impossible to read. For decades, audiences across America watched him ride across dusty western landscapes, stare down criminals without fear, and walk away from danger without ever looking back. He became the last symbol of a certain kind of American masculinity. Hollywood no longer seems capable of creating a man who never explained himself, a man who never begged to be understood. But behind that legendary image was another story Hollywood rarely talks about anymore. Because for all the women who admired Clint Eastwood from afar, there were only a handful who ever truly got close enough to change him. And strangely, those relationships never seemed to disappear completely. Some ended quietly, some ended painfully, some turned into years of regret, distance, and silence. Yet, even now, decades later, their names still remain attached to Clint Eastwood's story in a way Hollywood cannot erase. The truth is, Clint Eastwood spent most of his life playing men who could leave anyone behind. Cowboys, detectives, lonely drifters, men built to survive without emotional attachments. But outside the movie's reality was far more complicated. There were women who stood beside him before the fame arrived. Women who entered his life when he was already one of the most desired men in America. And women who witnessed the side of Clint Eastwood the cameras almost never saw. Some relationships gave him peace, others nearly destroyed it. And perhaps that is why these stories still fascinate audiences today, because beneath the tough voice, the controlled expression, and the image of the invincible Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood always seemed haunted by something far more personal than fame. By the women, long before Clint Eastwood became one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood history, he was simply another young man trying to survive in post-war America. Born during the difficult years of the Great Depression, Clint grew up moving from town to town as his family searched for stability. Nothing about his early life suggested he would someday become the final icon of old Hollywood masculinity. In fact, many people inside the film industry initially believed he would never become a major star at all. He was considered too quiet, too stiff, too emotionally distant. But somehow those very qualities became the foundation of his legend. Everything began changing when Clint appeared in Rawhide during the late 1950s. American audiences immediately noticed the tall young actor with the calm voice and unreadable expression. Then came the Western films that transformed him forever. Suddenly, Clint Eastwood was no longer just another television actor. He became the face of a new kind of movie hero. Dangerous without speaking much, strong without trying too hard, the kind of man audiences trusted the moment he walked onto the screen. By the time Dirty Harry exploded into American theaters, Clint Eastwood was more than a movie star. He had become a cultural symbol. To millions of Americans, he represented a version of masculinity tied to strength, independence, and emotional control. Hollywood kept changing around him through the decades, but Clint somehow remained standing while countless other stars faded away. Yet the larger his image became, the more complicated his personal life seemed to grow. Fame surrounded Clint Eastwood with attention everywhere he went. Hollywood wanted him. The media followed him constantly. Women across America admired him. But people close to Clint often described him as deeply private, even difficult to fully understand. He rarely discussed emotions openly. He almost never explained his relationships to the public. And perhaps because of that silence, the women who entered his life became surrounded by mystery. Some knew Clint before he became untouchable. Some fell in love with the legend the world created around him. Some believed they understood him completely. And some eventually realized that loving Clint Eastwood also meant living in the shadow of Hollywood itself. Over the years, many women passed through Clint Eastwood's life, but only a few seemed to leave permanent marks behind, the kind time never fully erased. And the first woman on that list knew Clint Eastwood before America ever did. Number 5, Maggie Johnson. Before the fame, before the headlines, before Hollywood transformed Clint Eastwood into one of the most desired men in America, there was Maggie Johnson. And perhaps that is what made her impossible for Clint Eastwood to completely leave behind. She did not meet the legend. She met the uncertain young man long before the world decided who he was supposed to become. When Clint first met Maggie during the 1950s, he was still struggling to establish himself in Hollywood. He was not yet the cold-eyed icon audiences would later worship in westerns and crime films. He was simply another actor trying to survive in an industry filled with rejection. Maggie reportedly saw something in Clint long before most studio executives did. At a time when Hollywood viewed him as too awkward and too quiet to become a star, she believed his calm presence made him different. And for a while, their relationship looked almost surprisingly normal. That is the strange thing many people forget about Clint Eastwood today. Before Hollywood fully consumed his life, there were moments when he seemed close to building the traditional American future people expected during that era. Marriage, stability, a private life away from cameras. Maggie represented that version of Clint Eastwood. The version that still belonged to the real world instead of Hollywood mythology. But then, everything changed. As Clint's career exploded through Rawhide, and later his legendary Western films, the attention surrounding him became impossible to control. Fame transformed him into a fantasy figure for millions of women across America. The quiet young husband Maggie once knew slowly became something much larger and far more dangerous to a normal marriage. Hollywood constantly surrounded Clint with temptation, admiration, and distance. And the higher his career climbed, the harder it became to preserve the life they originally started together. To many fans, Maggie Johnson eventually became symbolic of something Clint Eastwood could never fully recover once he lost its normalcy. Because before the awards, before the power, before becoming one of the final giants of old Hollywood, Clint Eastwood still had a chance at an ordinary life. And Maggie was standing beside him during that brief period when everything still seemed possible. Years later, audiences would continue seeing Clint play lonely men drifting through life without emotional attachments. But people who look closely at his story often wonder something very different. Did Clint Eastwood spend the rest of his life chasing a freedom that ultimately cost him the one relationship built before the fame arrived? And if Hollywood had never turned him into a legend, would Maggie Johnson still have been the woman waiting for him at home? Number 4, Shirley MacLaine. If Maggie Johnson represented the life Clint Eastwood might have lived before fame changed everything, then Shirley MacLaine represented something completely different. She belonged to the mysterious, glamorous version of old Hollywood that Clint Eastwood spent most of his life trying to stay away from, and yet somehow always seemed connected to. By the time Clint and Shirley became linked together in Hollywood circles, both had already become major stars in America. But they came from entirely different worlds. Shirley MacLaine was outspoken, emotional, spiritual, unpredictable. She embraced attention and celebrity culture in ways Clint Eastwood never fully trusted. Clint preferred silence, distance, control. The less people knew about him, the more comfortable he seemed. And maybe that contrast is exactly what fascinated people. because whenever audiences saw Shirley MacLaine and Clint Eastwood connected in the same Hollywood conversations, it felt like watching two completely opposite forces somehow exist within the same fading era of American cinema. Shirley represented the glamorous side of classic Hollywood. Clint represented the lonely cowboy spirit that Hollywood was slowly losing forever. There was always something difficult to explain about the energy surrounding them. Not necessarily scandal, not necessarily romance in the traditional Hollywood sense. It was deeper than gossip. It was the feeling that these were two people who understood a version of fame younger generations would never fully experience again. Both had survived decades inside one of the cruelest industries in the world. Both watched old Hollywood slowly disappear around them, and both understood what it felt like to become symbols larger than ordinary human beings. For Clint Eastwood especially, women like Shirley MacLaine seemed to leave emotional marks precisely because they reminded him of a world he secretly missed, a slower Hollywood, a more dangerous Hollywood, a Hollywood where stars still felt untouchable and mysterious instead of constantly exposed to the public every second of the day. As the years passed, America changed. Movies changed, celebrity culture changed, but figures like Clint Eastwood and Shirley MacLaine remained connected to a kind of nostalgia audiences still crave today. They reminded people of an era when movie stars felt almost mythological. And perhaps that is why Shirley MacLaine remained impossible for Clint Eastwood to fully leave behind in the minds of fans. Because when people think of the final years of true old Hollywood glamour, their names still seem to belong to the same disappearing world. A world Clint Eastwood may never stop missing. Number 3. Dina Eastwood. For most of his life, Clint Eastwood carefully protected the image America had built around him. Quiet, tough, emotionally distant. The kind of man who never seemed completely comfortable letting the public too close. That was part of what made him fascinating for so many decades. Audiences felt like they were always looking at a man hiding something deeper beneath the surface. And then suddenly, during the 1990s and early 2000s, something changed. When Dina Eastwood entered Clint Eastwood's life, fans across America noticed a version of him they had rarely seen before. Lighter, more relaxed, sometimes even playful. Dina was younger, energetic, comfortable around cameras and modern media in ways Clint never naturally was. Standing beside her, Clint Eastwood no longer looked like the isolated cowboy drifting through Hollywood alone. For a brief period, he actually appeared happy. That surprised people more than almost anything else in his personal life. Because by then, Clint had already become larger than ordinary celebrity culture. He was not simply another actor anymore. He was a living symbol of old America, and many fans quietly assumed men like Clint Eastwood no longer changed emotionally late in life. Yet Dina seemed to soften certain edges audiences thought would remain permanent forever. Their relationship fascinated the public partly because of the age difference, but even more because of how different they appeared emotionally. Dina belonged to a newer generation shaped by openness, television culture, and public visibility. Clint came from an older America where emotions stayed private and personal struggles remained hidden behind closed doors. At times, it almost felt like their marriage represented two completely different Hollywood eras trying to coexist together. Then came the reality television attention surrounding their family life. And for many long-time Clint Eastwood fans, that was deeply strange to witness. The man who spent decades protecting his privacy was suddenly allowing cameras into parts of his personal world. Some viewers loved seeing this softer side of Clint. Others wondered whether Hollywood and modern celebrity culture was slowly pulling him away from the mysterious image that made him iconic in the first place. But underneath everything, there was still a feeling audiences could not ignore. Dina genuinely seemed to care about Clint Eastwood as a person, not simply as a legend. And maybe Clint understood that too, which is why the collapse of their marriage felt unexpectedly painful to many Americans. Not because it was explosive or scandalous, but because for a little while people believed Clint Eastwood had finally found peace after decades of emotional distance. And when that peace disappeared, audiences were reminded once again of something Clint Eastwood's life had proven over and over. No matter how powerful the legend becomes, Hollywood rarely allows anyone to hold on to happiness forever. Number 2, Meryl Streep. There are certain films audiences never truly forget, not because of explosions, controversy, or massive box office numbers, but because something inside them feels emotionally real in a way Hollywood almost never achieves anymore. For millions of Americans, especially older audiences, The Bridges of Madison County became exactly that kind of movie. And at the center of it was the unforgettable connection between Clint Eastwood and Meryl Streep. What made the film so powerful was not simply the romance itself. It was the feeling that viewers were watching two people carrying entire lifetimes of loneliness behind their eyes. Clint Eastwood had spent decades building an image around toughness and emotional restraint. He rarely allowed vulnerability onto the screen, even in his greatest films. There was usually distance between Clint and the audience, as though he refused to fully let people inside his characters. But something changed when he appeared beside Meryl Streep. Suddenly, Clint Eastwood no longer seemed untouchable. In that film, audiences saw exhaustion, longing, regret, tenderness, emotions he had spent most of his career hiding beneath silence. And many fans quietly believe no actress ever unlocked that side of Clint more naturally than Meryl Streep did. The chemistry between them felt unusually mature and painfully believable. This was not young Hollywood fantasy. It was something older audiences understood immediately. Two people realizing life may have brought love into their lives too late. Two people forced to choose between passion and responsibility. And perhaps that emotional realism is why the movie stayed with audiences for decades afterward. Many viewers did not feel like they were watching movie stars anymore. They felt like they were watching two people revealing pieces of themselves through the story. For Clint Eastwood especially, the film represented a major turning point in how audiences viewed him. Until then, many Americans still primarily associated him with gunslingers, detectives, and hardened men who survived through emotional control. But beside Meryl Streep, Clint revealed a softer kind of masculinity rarely seen in his earlier career. Quiet sadness, emotional vulnerability, the fear of losing something precious without ever fully possessing it. And perhaps that is why so many people continue connecting Meryl Streep to Clint Eastwood's legacy even now. Because long after the movie ended, audiences never forgot the feeling they created together on screen. In many ways, The Bridges of Madison County became more than a romantic drama. It became a reflection of aging missed chances and the painful reality that some relationships arrive at the wrong moment in life. For older American audiences especially, that story never stopped feeling personal. Number 1. Sondra Locke. If there was one woman Hollywood believes Clint Eastwood never truly escaped emotionally, it was almost certainly Sondra Locke. Because, unlike the other women connected to Clint Eastwood throughout his life, Sondra Locke was not simply part of a romance story. She became part of his entire world, his films, his private life, his public image. For years, their names felt inseparable inside Hollywood. And when everything eventually collapsed, the fallout became one of the most painful and uncomfortable chapters of Clint Eastwood's personal history. They first became closely connected during the 1970s, when Clint Eastwood was already standing at the peak of Hollywood power. By then, he was no longer just a movie star. He was becoming an institution inside the film industry itself. Directors respected him. Audiences trusted him instantly. Studios depended on him. And somewhere in the middle of that enormous fame, Sondra Locke entered his life. At first, they appeared almost perfectly matched. Sondra possessed intelligence, emotional intensity, and a quiet strength that seemed to balance Clint's cold exterior. She was not overwhelmed by his fame the way many people were. Instead, she became deeply integrated into both his personal and professional world. They worked together repeatedly on films, traveled together, and built a relationship that lasted for years under constant public attention. To audiences watching from afar, Sondra Locke seemed like the woman who understood Clint Eastwood better than anyone else. But relationships built inside Hollywood often carry pressures ordinary people never fully see. Over time, the cracks between them became impossible to hide. Rumors, emotional distance, career frustrations, and personal conflicts slowly transformed one of Hollywood's most famous relationships into something painfully bitter. Then came the lawsuits, accusations, media attention, and public embarrassment that followed their separation. Suddenly, the private, emotional damage between Clint and Sondra was unfolding in front of the entire country. For many Americans, it was shocking. Clint Eastwood had always appeared emotionally controlled, almost impossible to wound publicly. Yet the situation with Sondra Locke exposed a much messier and more human side of his life, a side filled with regret, resentment, silence, and unresolved pain. And perhaps that is why this relationship continues haunting Clint Eastwood's legacy more than any other. Because unlike brief romances or nostalgic Hollywood memories, Sondra Locke represented something deeper. She represented the period when Clint Eastwood's carefully controlled personal world finally fractured under the pressure of fame, love, and time itself. Even years later, people still debate who suffered more, who betrayed who failed to let go first. But maybe the real reason audiences never forgot Clint and Sondra is simpler than that. For a long time, they did not look like two celebrities. They looked like two people who genuinely believed they would spend the rest of their lives together. And Hollywood almost never allows stories like that to end peacefully. Today, Clint Eastwood stands as one of the last surviving symbols of a version of Hollywood America may never see again. The slow voice, the unreadable face, the lonely figures walking through dusty towns and broken cities without needing anyone beside them for decades. Clint Eastwood built an image around emotional control so powerful that audiences almost forgot there was a real man underneath it all. But perhaps that is why these stories still matter. Because behind every legendary performance, every Western hero, every hardened detective, there was still a human being trying to navigate love, loneliness, regret, and time itself. And the women who entered Clint Eastwood's life did more than simply appear beside a movie star. Each one captured a different version of the man Hollywood rarely allowed audiences to fully see. Maggie Johnson knew him before the fame transformed everything. Shirley MacLaine represented the fading glamour of old Hollywood he could never completely leave behind. Dina Eastwood briefly gave audiences the feeling Clint Eastwood had finally found peace. Meryl Streep helped reveal an emotional vulnerability millions of fans had never seen from him before. And Sondra Locke became part of the most painful and complicated chapter of all. Maybe that is the strange truth about icons like Clint Eastwood. The world remembers the toughness first, the silence, the confidence, the myth. But as time passes, audiences become more interested in something else entirely. The people who manage to reach the man hidden behind the legend. And perhaps Clint Eastwood understood something many Hollywood stars never did. Fame can make someone unforgettable to the world. But the relationships that shape a person's life often remain unforgettable in a far quieter way, especially the ones they never truly leave behind.